So it is currently stated that you should consume between 1.6 to 2.2 grams of protein per kilo of body weight per day. And that was that piece of research that stated that was published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine. What's really worth stating is what we see in that research paper is a plateauing effect at 2.2. So you see a spike, and this is muscle protein synthesis research. You see a spike at around 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilo of body weight where muscle protein synthesis is elevated. Then over 2.2, you see a flattening off of muscle protein synthesis. Hello and welcome to the Smart Strength Training podcast. So this is the second podcast episode of 2025, and today I'm talking about protein. This is the second time protein's come up on the podcast so far. Last time I spoke about the recommendations for protein. Today I'm going to talk about how to optimize your protein intake, because I see a lot of stuff on social media about protein that is probably going to trip you up a little bit if you try and go for everything that's recommended out there. So I want to make sure you really understand what's really important to know about protein, and then what are sort of the tiers or the hierarchy of what comes in next. But to fully understand this topic, I do think it's important just to know a bit of the science around protein. So we're going to do a deep dive into the science first. I would strongly advise to stick with this. And then when we get to recommendations, it will start to make more sense about why I'm going to suggest certain things. So what is protein? So protein is a macronutrient. It's one of the three macronutrients. And protein is essential in many body functions, including tissue repair, enzyme and hormone production, as well as supporting the immune system. Now, of course, this is a strength training podcast. So you're probably also aware that it plays a critical role in the growth and maintenance of muscle tissue. So what are proteins? Proteins are amino acids or composed of amino acids. Amino acids are organic compounds, and there are 20 different amino acids that we can get through our diet, 9 of which are classified as essential. Now, they're essential because the body cannot synthesize them internally, and therefore we must obtain them through the diet. Animal proteins such as meat, dairy, eggs, fish are all complete proteins. And if you follow a vegan or plant-based diet, certain plant-based protein sources are also complete. So soy products like tofu are complete proteins. So is buckwheat as well. But things like rice, chickpeas, beans and legumes, they are not complete proteins. So if you're following a plant-based diet, it is advised that you also combine your grains and your protein sources, which I think is generally what most vegans would be doing out there. Now, of those 9 essential amino acids, there are a subset called the branched chain amino acids. I think you may have heard of those because you might have seen the supplements that have BCAA on them, so your branched chain amino acids. And there are 3 of them. There are leucine, isoleucine, and valine. Leucine is the one that plays a key role in muscle protein synthesis, which we'll come to in just a second. And leucine is the one to just appreciate sometimes is lower in or for people that don't eat animal products. Pretty much all the animal products that you'll consume that are protein based are going to have a decent amount of leucine in. Soy actually does as well. So too do nuts and seeds and whole grains like oats. However, there are some studies that show vegans may have lower leucine intakes, which could affect that muscle protein synthesis. Like I said, we'll come to that next. So potentially for vegans, especially if they are very active or athletes, they should also consider incorporating leucine maybe as a supplement into their diet. So I've mentioned it already, muscle protein synthesis. This next bit really is the key thing to understand. So we have muscle protein synthesis, MPS, and we have muscle protein breakdown, MPB. So muscle protein synthesis is the process of building new proteins, and muscle protein breakdown involves the degradation of existing muscle proteins. So the relationship between muscle protein synthesis and muscle protein breakdown kind of is the most important thing that we are thinking about when it comes to ensuring we are going to build muscle. So we want a positive balance where muscle protein synthesis is higher than muscle protein breakdown, and not a negative balance where muscle protein breakdown is higher than muscle protein synthesis, because that would result in net muscle loss. It's important to state at this stage that proteins or amino acids make up the cells of all tissues in the body. So that's organ tissue, skin, hair, nail. It's not just about muscles, because you might think, why is the body breaking muscle down constantly? It's not, but it's redistributing proteins according to what needs to be rebuilt. And it's important to state that organ tissue and all cells in the human body are in constant flux of being regenerated. I think that makes sense. You recognize that your skin is flaking, and therefore the skin you have now is not the same skin you had a year ago. And that's true of pretty much all tissues in the human body. So we have this constant flux of muscle protein synthesis and muscle protein breakdown. First up, resistance training is the most potent stimulus when it comes to muscle protein synthesis. And muscle protein synthesis, if you look at research, can stay elevated from 24 hours up to 48 hours after workouts. And that's especially true, or the 48 hours is especially true in novice lifters. So we need a resistance training or some sort of stimulus on the muscle for muscle protein synthesis to be elevated. But then muscle protein synthesis is regulated by several metabolic pathways. So the most important one to know about is the mechanistic target of rapamycin, or MTor. And this is a central regulator for muscle protein synthesis. MTor is activated primarily by leucine as well as insulin and growth factors. And MTor, like I said, stimulates protein synthesis. So we mentioned leucine earlier. It's one of those branch chain amino acids, and it's super important for the activation of MTor. And then once MTor is activated, it initiates the translation of mRNA into new muscle proteins. We won't go into too much detail onto that, but just recognizing muscle protein synthesis needs this mTOR activation. So therefore, the role of leucine and dietary protein in that is key. And there is a balance between mTOR and something called AMP activated protein kinase. You might sometimes see this written as AMPK. So AMPK is important because that senses cellular energy, and that can inhibit mTOR in low energy conditions. So that means basically chronic dieting and chronic undereating will inhibit mTOR. So we need sufficient energy overall, and we need sufficient amino acids for muscle protein synthesis to occur, as I said already, as well as that stimulus from training. And it's worth stating, because it's referenced, I'm going to reference it in a little bit, that older adults experience something called anabolic resistance, meaning that muscle protein synthesis is reduced when eating dietary protein and exercise. So that mTOR activation is inhibited, and therefore it inhibits muscle protein synthesis in older adults. So therefore, they may need a slightly higher increase or slightly higher dosages of protein day to day to get that MPS, that muscle protein synthesis signaling. And just in case you're interested to know, because it's a bit gruesome, how on earth is muscle protein synthesis researched? How do we know this? What are we talking about? So participants ingest something called staple isotope tracers. And the idea now is that if you give these effectively these tracker amino acids after ingestion, they're going to be put into muscle tissue. And they are labeled amino acids effectively. And then researchers do muscle biopsies to analyze the muscle tissue to see how many of those tracer amino acids have actually been synthesized into protein. And muscle biopsies are literally having a thick needle stabbed into your muscle to take a sample. It is super, super painful, supposedly. I've never had it done. And the key thing to sort of know about this is it's not the sort of thing you can do all the time. So most muscle protein synthesis research is short, 12 up to 48 hours, which is important in a moment because I'm going to explain a few more things. That's the kind of key thing to know. So let's come to this optimization of your protein intake. So I mentioned the recommendations around protein, and I've done a podcast on this. So let's discuss those recommendations briefly now. So it is currently stated that you should consume between 1.6 to 2.2 grams of protein per kilo of body weight per day. And that was that piece of research that stated that was published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine. What's really worth stating is what we see in that research paper is a plateauing effect at 2.2. So you see a spike, and this is muscle protein synthesis research. You see a spike at around 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilo of body weight where muscle protein synthesis is elevated. Then over 2.2, you see a flattening off of muscle protein synthesis. So that's why the recommendations currently sit at 1.6 to 2.2. But I have stated on that other podcast episode that more recent research is coming out and it's showing to be slightly lower. But for the time being, I am going to stick to 1.6 to 2.2. But there are some considerations. So when we are dieting and therefore under consuming energy, we said that MTor can be inhibited by AMPK in a situation where dietary calories, dietary energy is low. So when you're dieting, you want to do everything in your power to keep muscle protein synthesis elevated. So we recommend you have a higher protein intake during dieting and going towards basically as high as you can get it into that sort of 2.2 grams. And it's all based on trying to keep that muscle protein synthesis elevated. So this is why I wanted you to understand that. So when I talk about why you want to take it up during a diet phase, it kind of makes sense because now you understand what muscle protein synthesis is all about. I also mentioned that in older adults, something called anabolic resistance is a factor. And this is especially true in women going through menopause. So that's another sort of demographic of people that should consider a higher protein intake or going towards the higher protein intakes. So the key takeaway here, or the key thing to know, is that total daily protein intake is the number one thing that you need to make sure you're doing as consistently as possible to help optimize your protein intake. In the hierarchy, coming down to the second point. So the second point is protein timing or protein distribution. So research suggests that distributing your protein evenly across 3 meals keeps muscle protein synthesis elevated throughout the day. So ideally, 3 protein servings, fairly evenly spaced out, is going to give that MPS signal, keep it high throughout the day. Going over 3 or certainly going up as high as things like 6 protein feedings per day doesn't seem to increase MPS that further. Around 3 to 4 servings seems to be the focus point. So just literally taking the amount of total day protein, dividing it across your 3 or 4 meals, that is key. So that protein timing, that's the second key point when it comes to optimizing your protein intake. Now, one more on the topic of optimizing or more the distribution, of protein. There is often something something called the anabolic window that's stated. And this was certainly years ago, people would say you have quite a narrow window after working out. You've created muscle protein breakdown by working out, and therefore we would have to increase our protein intake straight after training to get muscle protein synthesis elevated. And you might have heard people say that you should ingest protein between 30 to 60 minutes after training. However, more recent research has shown that window is actually far greater than we thought. So there's no real need to have a protein feeding directly after training. However, potentially there are some gender differences in this anabolic window because there has been some emerging research to say that women, again, in those postmenopausal women, because of anabolic resistance, potentially that muscle protein breakdown signal can be elevated greater and muscle protein synthesis can be slightly reduced. So therefore, a protein feeding after training can be beneficial. However, this area, the research is a little bit mixed. I know Stacey Sims, who's a very popular author in this space, is a big proponent of a post-workout protein feeding for women. I think that's probably true for highly active women or athletes. I don't think it's especially true for general recreational weightlifters. I think it's more practical to focus on those 3 to 4 protein servings throughout the day. It's really hard to know from the research that we've got if protein ingestion directly after training is going to have any meaningful effect, not necessarily to muscle protein synthesis. One of the things that is a limitation of muscle protein synthesis is, like I said, is it's done in 12 to 48 hours. If we look at the more longitudinal, so the more long-term research into hypertrophy, so building muscle as a whole, some of this stuff just doesn't seem to be quite so effective. And ultimately, I'd want to see more research on peri and postmenopausal women and protein timing or protein distribution. Right now, I don't think it's that important, but hey, if you want to go all in on protein optimization, then yep, thinking about a post-workout protein serving could be a smart thing to do if you're concerned about muscle protein synthesis, anabolic resistance, and you're going through or coming into menopause. Again, staying on topic when it comes to protein distribution, Drawn Tremolone, who is probably one of the most well-known protein researchers, has done extensive research on pre-sleep protein intakes, because then you can enhance, again, muscle protein synthesis throughout the night. And this can increase plasma amino acids that will be available throughout the night that can help with recovery of muscle cells overnight. That could feel like quite a lot. So now we're talking about 3 or 4 protein servings, a protein serving after you train and a protein serving before you go to bed. So I think it's really important that we say that the most important thing is that total daily protein intake. Second tier down of those 3 or 4 protein servings. And if you want to go down the sort of rabbit hole of really optimizing every single thing and you want a post-workout and a pre-bedtime protein feeding, then by all means go for it. One thing to state at that stage is protein quality and digestibility, which is the kind of next tier down. Things like whey protein, milk protein are very fast acting. You're going to digest that protein very, very quickly. So if you're consuming foods that are just protein intake foods, such as a pre-bedtime feeding, then something like a whey protein isn't going to be really smart because you're going to digest that super, super quick. Whereas having foods or whole food protein sources like chicken or tofu, those sort of things that you actually have to digest, they're going to be slower to absorb into the bloodstream. So in the evening, that would make sense. Whereas directly after training, actually having some kind of quickly absorbed protein intake could be smart. So in that situation, a powdered protein source could be good, and therefore whey protein could fit that. I think it's really good just to recognize that you do need to have a little bit of trial and error when it comes to protein intake, because the digestibility of them, obviously people can get gas and bloating from various protein products. So just giving someone an arbitrary number like 2.2 grams per kilo of body weight and telling them to run off and try and hit that doesn't always end up so well. So I would generally suggest to up these things gradually, so you can see how you feel on them. One last thing just to state here. So as much as like protein digestibility and protein quality is important in the sense of you want to make sure that you're having those fast acting or slow acting proteins depending on when you're eating them. If you're just thinking about protein in those 3 meals, you would generally go to whole food forms of protein. You might have heard, I've also said it on this podcast, that protein is 4 calories per gram. Now, that's not actually true. Protein will be somewhere between 2.8 to 3.4 calories per gram after you calculate for its thermic effect or its high thermic effect. To break those amino acids down in the gut, that utilizes quite a lot of energy, and so therefore taking that sort of metabolizable energy off the amounts of protein you consume, you're left with something around 2.8 to 4 grams of protein. So, and that's true of any protein source, be that a fast acting protein source or a slower acting protein source. But like I said, that ranges from 2.8 to 3.4. Let's now address some common misconceptions within protein. So first up is the usual high protein diets are going to damage your kidneys. That has only been shown to be true in any research where people have pre-existing kidney issues. If you are healthy, a moderate to high protein diet has been pretty much, I won't say proven, but we certainly have a good amount of evidence to suggest it is safe to consume. The next up is this idea that you can only absorb 20 to 30 grams of protein per meal. Now, this is why I wanted to make sure you understood what muscle protein synthesis was about. Based on the early muscle protein synthesis research, that did seem to be the case, that ingesting protein amounts of 20 to 30 grams would give you the most MPS signaling, and taking it up to things like 50 grams didn't seem to do quite as much. The problem with that research is it's short term, so 12 up to 48 hours, and they weren't looking at hypertrophy and muscle building outcomes. They were just looking at MPS signaling. And as much as MPS signaling is very, very important, we also have to recognize things like total daily protein intake, other habits, exercise habits. But when we look at more longitudinal data, looking at a protein intake that's high and low on outcomes that we actually really care about, so how much muscle you can build, we can see then that the amount of protein you consume does matter. So the 20 to 30 grams, as much as it is one of those things you see in that MPS, the muscle protein synthesis research, it does not mean your body cannot absorb all that protein. It just means the signaling is highest directly after consumption, around 20 to 30 grams. It also just to state that obviously it takes a while to digest proteins fully. So if you have a meal of protein, they're going to take 4, 6, 8 hours to digest. And in most muscle protein synthesis research, they always use whey protein, which I've already said is a fast-acting protein. So as much as it's interesting, it's not absolute, so I wouldn't focus on it at all. Often you hear people say that plant-based proteins are inferior. As I've already stated, that is not true. You might just need a mixture of plant proteins, and potentially it is worthwhile thinking about adding leucine as a dietary supplement if you are a strict plant-based or vegan. Okay, to wrap up, or some final things to consider, because there are some important takeaways before you start running off of that information. So first up, I mentioned that a higher protein intake is important when you're on a diet. That can be problematic. If you're shooting for 2.2 grams per kilo of body weight per day, and you're a petite frame and you weigh 50 to 60 kilos, that's not going to give you much wiggle room when it comes to calories to play elsewhere. So then you have this trade-off between going high or going to the very top end of protein recommendations, and then just the fact that it becomes very unsustainable to do it. And the reality is, as I mentioned, we see that flattening off, that plateauing of muscle protein synthesis after 2.2. And it's not to say that 2.2 grams per kilo is far superior than 1.6. So I think it's important that you have to think about someone's overall body weight before you start taking these numbers and running with it. And again, that's relevant for women going through menopause that potentially are also trying to shoot for the higher amount. Because if you're trying to shoot for the higher amount, you're thinking about a post-workout feeding to try and inhibit any issues with anabolic resistance. Again, it might just not be practical to do it. It can often add more admin to people's life. And when it becomes a challenge and when trying to stay on top of your health feels like that hard work, I think it's really important to go back to the hierarchy and say total daily protein intake matters the most. Spacing it out 3 to 4 meals also matters. I don't necessarily think that anabolic resistance is something to worry about too much if you've got your first 2 rocks in place. But of course, I see people on social media, they see this information, I think they want to help and potentially want to sound smart, but by doing so, it overcomplicates things. It puts pressure on people, particularly women, to try and hit an exact protein amount and get this protein timing nailed in. And we always want to focus on getting the big rocks in place first. So those total protein intake, and then spreading it out across 3 meals. And then the rest, if you've got the patience, the desire to optimize every small detail, then great, then go for it. But for everyone else, I think just going for that total daily protein intake and spreading it out evenly across 3 to 4 meals is going to give you everything that you need to with your protein intake. So hopefully that gave you clarity on what's really important on the topic of protein consumption.